Good morning, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for the invitation. I will not speak about all the pleasant feelings, but I will speak about ecstatic and mystic feeling. And I have done this work with my colleagues Fabrice Bartholomei and Mihai Milia, who did much of the work. The concept of ecstatic epilepsy was introduced in medical community after Gasto's dissertation on the epileptic seizures experienced by Dostoevsky. And ecstatic symptoms are complex affective, emotional, and cognitive phenomena which comprise a sense of certainty or mental clarity, or state of knowledge, a sense of oneness or unity with the universe, and bliss, so intense positive emotion. People often describe also a feeling of physical well-being and a sense of eternal now, a sense of timelessness. So it is very close to what the American philosopher and psychologist William James described as a mystical experience. And some of the patients may interpret their ecstatic aura as a religious experience. So ecstatic epilepsy is rare. There are reports of single case or short case series, but it is very likely underestimated because people are often reluctant to speak about these symptoms. They don't find the word to speak about what they have experienced, and they are afraid that we take them for crazy people. So often they just talk about feeling of lightness or warmth going up to the head. Ecstatic epilepsy had long been associated with temporal lobe epilepsy, but based on cases which were not investigated in epilepsy surgery paradigm. And recent data point to the involvement of the entire insula on the basis of cases which have been explored with intracranial recordings. The main issues are what is the relation between the epileptogenic and the symptomatogenic zone in this kind of epilepsy. Does this symptom have a strong lateralizing or localizing value? And what is the outcome of the case which are operated? So our keywords were these ones, which were searched in PubMed and Embase. And our criteria were that the mystical or bliss feature applied to the seizures and not to the interictal state. And we also took the single cases because of the rarity of this kind of epilepsy. So we found 161 citations. We reviewed 70 abstracts. We reviewed in detail 50 papers and selected 38 papers with a number of patients included of 65. I will separate my presentation in a part about the epileptogenic zone and a part on the symptomatogenic zone in the context of the propagation network. So you can see that we had 7 studies, including between 2 and 11 patients, and 24 other studies, single case studies. And you can see in the single case studies that the rate of stereo EEG was low, only 17% of patients with stereo EEG investigation. So all patients were adults. Less than half of them had a lesion on MRI. Only 1/5 of them had SEG. 1/3 were operated, and on these operated patients, 1/3 became Engel class 1. So in total, 22% of the patients had a high or very high confidence in the epileptogenic zone. 6 patients high and 8 very high. This is a synthesis of the patients with very high level of evidence for the epileptogenic zone. So the location was essentially temporal, of which 3 were in the temporobasal region and 2 in the temporal pole. And 2 other patients were around the insula, one in the inferior insula and temporal operculum, and the other in the orbitofrontal and spreading to the anterior insula. Patients with a high level of evidence, 6 patients, 1 with Engel 1, but not 1A, 4 with a restricted cortical lesion, so to be part of the epileptogenic zone by the authors, and 1 well-delineated epileptogenic zone according to intracranial data. So on these 6 patients, 5 had an epileptogenic zone in the temporal lobe, 2 anterior, the temporal pole, 2 mesial, and 1 was in the hippocampus and temporobasal region. And the other patient had an epileptogenic zone in the dorsal anterior insula, in the middle short gyrus, according to intracranial EEG data. So in total, there were 14 patients, mostly men, with a small difference in lateralization, but nothing very important. And the localization was then temporal in 11 patients. You can see 4 anterior, 3 basotemporal, 2 mesial, and 1 basal and mesial. And the 3 others were around the insula, 1 in the temporal operculum and inferior insula, the other one in the dorsal anterior insula, and the last in the orbitofrontal and anterior insula. And they nearly all had a brain lesion on MRI, with mostly tumors. Now the part on the symptomatogenic zone. We also separated our results in very high evidence for the region and high evidence. Very high evidence when we could replicate by the electrical stimulation the ecstatic aura that the patient had during their epilepsy, or induced ecstatic aura through an electrical stimulation. And high evidence when, during spontaneous seizures, there was a localized discharge during the ecstatic aura in SEG with a large sampling with SEG. Or high evidence when we could reproduce the ecstatic aura through electrical stimulation, but without knowing that if there was or not after discharge. And for 1 patient with a localized SYSCOM during aura, we use him for high evidence symptomatogenic zone. So first, patients with ecstatic epilepsy. There were 7 patients. 4 of them had on spontaneous seizure a major temporal start with a very rapid propagation towards the anterior insula, and we could reproduce their ecstatic aura through electrical stimulation in the dorsal anterior insula. One patient, this one, had a start through SEEG within the dorsal anterior insula, but he did not have electrical stimulations. And the first of the table had a circumspect showing an increased blood flow within the operculo-insular part of the dorsal anterior insula. Here you have the example of the 3 patients from Marseille with, in blue, the contacts in which we could reproduce the ecstatic aura in the very dorsal part of the anterior insula. Here it is a patient from Rennes, studied by Anka Nika, and stimulations in the right ventral and dorsal anterior insula could reproduce the ecstatic auras without any after discharge, while on the left insula there was also a reproduction of the ecstatic aura, but with an after discharge in the same electrode in the nearby contacts. Here are 2 videos.
De bien-être, du bonheur.
Oui, oui.
Être serein,
Ouais.
Comme ça.
Ouais.
Être uni avec le monde.
Oui, un peu, ouais.
Un peu.
Ouais.
Pas de l'impression de flotter, par exemple.
Non, flotter, non, mais genre de connexion, quoi.
For those who cannot read, he says that there is a sort of connection with the surroundings and that it was very pleasant.
Ouais.
And another case.
C'est assez
Vous
puissant.
voyez des choses?
Assez
Est-ce que vous voyez?
Non, je vois rien, non.
D'accord. Ça continue là pour vous?
Celui-là était fort. Hein.
C'était plus fort.
Ouais.
Non, c'est une sensation de bien-être.
Ouais.
It's a well-being sensation.
C'est quelque chose qui est plus dans la tête et ça monte comme ça.
Ouais.
It's
Là,
going
j'ai l'impression que
up to
c'était
the
plus dans la tête, par contre.
Plus dans la tête.
Ouais.
Ça vient pas avec des idées plaisantes, c'est juste...
Non,
C'est
c'est
bien.
juste une sensation de bien-être. Je me sens bien. Ça me fait, parce que étant jeune, comme je disais ça souvent au médecin,
Ouais.
So
étant jeune, j'ai pris, ça m'est arrivé 1 ou 2 fois de prendre des
he says that it is
champignons hallucinogènes. Et ça me rappelle un peu ces sensations-là.
Agréable.
Agréable, ouais. Très agréable.
so. For those who couldn't read because it's below, he said it was powerful and it reminded him what he could feel during the taking of psychedelics when he was young with LSD or mushrooms. So this is a case of the team of Philippe Kahn. The circle with the number 5 was a case of a patient in whom the discharge started in this region of the dorsal anterior insula and who had as a first symptom a hyperclear environment and hyperclear thoughts. And this is the circumspect of the patient from Geneva who had an ecstatic epilepsy, and this is an ictal spec during an ecstatic seizure, showing this increased blood flow in the operculo-insular region on the right. Now we also identified 3 patients without ecstatic epilepsy, in whom we could induce ecstatic aura through electrical stimulations. These are the 3 patients. In the second patient, the description was time dilation, but he also described that he had symptoms overlapping with those experienced while tripping as a teenager with LSD and mushrooms as the other patient. And the third patient was from Geneva, and I just show you the location of the contacts inducing the ecstatic aura. So he had a temporal lobe epilepsy and never had ecstatic phenomena, but during the stimulations, he reported an ecstatic experience through the stimulation of these contacts in the dorsal anterior insula. So, for the symptomatogenic zone within the propagation network, we had these patients with very high or high level of evidence according to us. So 9 patients, the 7 with very high evidence had some ecstatic experience through the stimulations of the dorsal anterior insula, most in the anterior short gyrus, then in the middle short gyrus, and only 1 patient in the posterior short gyrus, 1 ventral anterior insula, and 1 frontal operculum. And the 2 patients with only high level of evidence had this kind of ecstatic experience through the stimulation of dorsal anterior insula or central operculum. So most of these patients were MRI negative, and you can see the synthesis of the locations. In addition, I have also 3 personal communications which have not been published, 2 from 2 other additional from Marseille and 1 from Grenoble, who had at SEEG start in the major temporal region with a very rapid propagation to the anterior insula. 1 of them had also a reproduction of his ecstatic auras through electrical stimulation of the left anterior insula. So in a synthesis, the temporal region has an overall high level of confidence for the epileptogenic zone in nearly 80% of the patients with the other locations. And for the symptomatogenic zone, the dorsal anterior insula has also a high grade level of confidence, but for both, the number of patients is limited. To conclude, there is a very low number of patients with high confidence in the delineation of the epileptogenic zone, 14 patients. The localization remain as it was thought for long in the temporal lobe for the epileptogenic zone, most often in the anterior or mesial region, and in these published patients also in the basotemporal region. And concerning the symptomatogenic zone, you could see that it was mostly localized in the dorsal part of the anterior insula, but it could also be the ventral part in 1 or 2 patients. And mostly in the short gyri, which are more anterior. There are surprisingly more male patients. There were 19 males, if I count also the 3 not published patients, against 6 women. And the lateralization is not so clear. It was 15 and 10. I think it's not significant. I thank you.